This will be a very short one. I just wanted to mention something about the past month or so, month and a day, of what's been happening in Israel and obviously in Gaza and on the northern border of Israel with Lebanon and in Judea and Samaria, also is the west bank of the River Jordan. And to remind everybody that at the beginning of this war, I made several analyses, and also recently, and not only analyses, but predictions and suggestions. And so far, most of them, really all of them but one, have come to pass. And one of them has sort of come to pass. What do I mean by this? Okay, so real quick, the analysis about the likelihood that this was not actually as much of a surprise as the Israeli government, and specifically the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, initially suggested that it was, has been demonstrated with a lot of evidence that he knew about this probability years ahead of time, and he knew about the active probability at least weeks, if not months ahead of time. And we've seen that from the communiques from the diplomats from Egypt, who said they called, the foreign ministry of Egypt said that they called the Prime Minister of Israel, which of course would leave a telecommunications trail, because calls from ministers to heads of governments leave telecommunications trails. We saw that in the, the letter from the former member of government, Lieberman, when he was in charge of the ministry dealing with security years ago, and he wrote a letter to the Prime Minister, who knew about this years ago. We saw this when the people in Gaza, the Hamas fighters and all that, the terrorists, whatever you want to call them, were practicing, rehearsing their drills actively out in the open, and the Israeli government basically ignored it. The Israeli Prime Minister ignored it. Publicly, he says he was thinking that they were just regular drills, or it's been suggested that he said that. The head of the Israeli version of the FBI, called the Shabak, which works for the office of the Prime Minister, has taken responsibility for the failure of not, catching this, which means they knew it was going to happen. All of the nonsense about, this was all done with old school telecommunications, landlines that were hardwired, and offline messaging is complete nonsense, because it was obviously handwritten notes, even if that was true. A lot of speeches, a lot of spoken, messages in groups, and you have to remember there are people embedded over there, so they would absolutely have known, because there are people embedded in the organization that was doing all of the planning and the execution of this terrible attack on October 7th. And you have to remember that information like that, which is in the planning for years and is even known, even if it's just among a dozen people, is going to get out to some other people. So it's not possible that the Israeli government basically didn't know. They absolutely knew. And the likelihood is, they knew ahead of time and they allowed it to happen. Now, I still don't blame Israel for the size and scope of what happened, but it did happen. It was terrible, and the people who did it absolutely acted in the most barbaric ways and did horrible things. We all know, but if you don't know, you should learn. They did absolutely terrible things on that day, and did all the bad stuff that we know about. In addition to that, my suggestion that Israel could do, among many other responses, would be to subtly or not so subtly remind the world, and especially our neighbors, the neighbors of Israel, I mean, that Israel has nuclear power, and that did in fact happen. Some member of government opened his mouth and said something to the effect of, "Oh, we should use, we have these things, we should use them or whatever." Kind of a non-threat threat, but and he's not in any position of power. He's not capable of, obviously launching such an order, giving such an order, but he is in government, so he did give that message, and so my suggestion that would happen did in fact happen, even though he was promptly and swiftly spoken to and browbeaten for saying what he said, and said, no, you shouldn't have said such a thing, it's a terrible thing, it's absolutely foolish and idiotic, and of course we're not going to do that. Sure, but at least the world has been reminded, we do have these things in Israel, and so Israel does, has let everybody know, don't forget, even though we may not officially admit that we have them, and we're not saying we're going to use them. We're saying we're not going to use them, but be aware, ski with care, right? Like it's still a possibility. So if you ever threaten our actual existence as a nation, there's always that option, right? That Israel could take. And then, so again, that's not a lovely analysis to have made and a prediction to have made, but it is correct. Yet another one is the notion of the Arabs surrendering, right? If Hamas surrendered, this war would be over. And I've been saying almost from the beginning in different videos and everything else, that if they would just surrender, this would be over. And everybody told me, no, they're not going to surrender. Well, I remind you, the Nazis of Germany surrendered at the end of World War II. The Imperial Japanese Army in World War II surrendered. Many armies in the world throughout history have surrendered. Even groups that weren't officially armies have surrendered. So they don't just have to be classic armies, which of course Hamas is not, and Hezbollah is not, but specifically Hamas, because that's the group that Israel is fighting the most actively at the moment. So it is entirely possible that even though they have psychopathic genocidal dreams right now, they could decide to surrender today and change their ideology, right? The Nazis surrendered and gave up their genocidal ideology. The Imperial Japanese surrendered and gave up their psychopathic ideology, right? Their suicidal or whatever ideology. Like they decided to, make peace with the West, and they got peace with the West. And it was the side that was psychopathic or genocidal or seeking violence, right, as a purpose, as an intention, as an aim, as a goal. The side that was seeking violence that surrendered when they got defeated. The side that was not seeking violence but was merely defending itself against the aggressions of the side seeking violence won the war, accepted the surrender of their enemy, and made peace with them. So the same exact thing can happen in this situation. The side seeking violence, which is the Hamas, and in general the Palestinian side, although yes, of course, not all Palestinians are suicidal, genocidal, violent maniacs, obviously. The vast majority of them, we have to, if they're not involved with terrorist groups, you can't just assume that they're violent. Yes, a lot of them do support the violent groups, but to what degree, all these things matter in shades of context. So civilians in general are not engaged in terror activities, even though they may support those terror activities, which is a terrible thing. But their ideology can be changed as soon as their wacko leaders surrender. And that's what I'm saying. And notably, there have been a number of people now that have made the same suggestion. People whose voices are, for whatever reason, more prominent than mine, more popular than mine. It doesn't matter. Voices like Ben Shapiro or other people that have been speaking on different YouTube channels and videos and messages and newspaper articles. So the words the Arabs, the Hamas should surrender, have become more popular, and I would say it's not by accident. It's because we realize that this is a very distinct possibility, and that's how wars end, right? Typically, one side surrenders, and if you don't have this one side surrender, what is going to happen is the conflict is just going to continue, right? If Israel is forced to accept a ceasefire, and I mean forced by the powers that be around the world that have a lot of influence with it, then we're just going to have more fighting eventually. Because why? Because Hamas is going to just wait a while, rearm, regroup, and launch another attack. Right? They've done it time and time and time and time again, and on and on and on and on since their very inception. If Israel is not forced to accept the ceasefire and is allowed to carry out its operation, as ugly as it is, then there is a chance that the Hamas will be defeated or at least driven to the point where they will surrender their genocidal dreams and they will accept the loss, take the L, be man about it, as opposed to living in a world of bravado and fake, and lies and nonsense. They can own up to it. They can say, okay, we did this thing, we lost, we surrender, right? They could do that, and they'll find that they'll get peace with Israel. But of course, it takes the will to do that, and whether or not they have the will to do that is still yet to be determined. So hopefully we will see peace in this embattled region soon in the Middle East, and hopefully life will go forward and everybody will have a life of peace and prosperity. But until then, unfortunately, the sad reality is the battle lingers on, and my analysis and predictions continue to be accurate, even if I don't always want them to be. I wish that it could be otherwise. I wish that I could just say lovely things and only the lovely things would happen, and that would be great. But unfortunately, we live in a world where there's sometimes ugly things, and it's important to not shy away from that and still make the relevant analysis and predictions and suggestions based on the facts, not on fantasies. So, all right, folks, there you have it. That's going to do it for now. So take care. Ciao.